Hello, students. Just to finish up on our discussion of Winesburg, Ohio, and Sherwood Anderson, I thought I would throw some thoughts out at you. If you have your textbook in front of you, we can go through a few of these stories, and I'll share with you some of the insights that I've been able to glean from students over the last couple of years as we've read these books. But think about in class the way that we discussed repression in Freud, and this is a key element that Anderson seems to be really attempting to embody and illustrate in these stories, particularly the first one, Hands. I think it was selected by the editors of the text to show this is one where it really does seem to be very explicitly calling out some of these Freudian concepts. So that you have overall this character, Wing Biddlebaum, who we know is not actually named Wing. We find out later in the story. But of course, just as Edna had the symbolism of the wing and the bird that couldn't fly, there's something about Wing and the way that it is identified with his character. And also the second name, Biddlebaum, kind of has this kind of diminished and sort of silly sort of sound to it, where you have this person who we got to get at what the Freudian analysis might be here of what is the repression here, and of course it could be, and this is where we go back to our introduction, where it talked about so much of the modern literature has this sort of conflicted stance where there are usually no easy answers, there's usually no black or white answers, and we're not 100% certain of what Adolf Wing is guilty of, if anything. But we know that his hands got him into trouble. And so in the story, he's always very nervous about his hands, and there's much talk about the berry picking at the beginning, and he sees the berry pickers coming out from the fields. And we learn later that this man who had sort of been this beloved teacher, he fell out because he was being inappropriate with the children from the standpoint of the adults. He was touching them too much. And again, it's kind of left open-ended whether he was touching them inappropriately or not, but those hands were doing things that he couldn't control. And so now, as a character, he has to sort of sublimate, as Freud would say, and take these impulses, whatever these impulses are, of his hands, and he's got to put them to a useful purpose. And in this case, we learn he is able to find this job picking berries, and he can pick berries faster than anybody in the whole town. And he also has this scene at the end where he's picking up the breadcrumbs. So there's something really interesting going on there with the hands. The title of the book is Hands. It has this very deep sort of psychoanalytic repressed notion. So the hands are doing what the man doesn't want them to do. So he has these repressed urges or desires that come out in inappropriate ways. Now, are these repressed desires towards knowledge, fraternity, towards this ideal of what we have described as sort of this Greek image of the days when the sophists or the philosophers would meet with their young charges, and they'd be in these galleries, and they'd be going through philosophy and these really sort of heady, deep topics, and you'd get very passionate about it. And when he met with his students, there was this sense that he kind of had this sort of extreme sort of attachment or emotional response in his teaching his students. This is illustrated very explicitly on page 254, 255 in your book, where one of the only people that comes over to meet with Wing, who is kind of made fun of at the beginning. He's a freak of town. He lives on the outskirts of town. People make fun of him. He's this weirdo. Is George Willard comes out to speak with him, and they have this kind of relationship of a mentorship. And now, remember, we learn later in the story that Wing got in trouble for having too close a relationship with his students. So when George comes over, he has this sort of rupture where he gets very passionate about these things, these higher sort of ideas. So on page 254, on the grassy bank, Wing Biddlebaum had tried again to drive his point home. His voice became soft and reminiscent, and with a sigh of contentment, he launched into a long rambling talk, speaking as one lost in a dream. Out of the dream, Wing Bindlebaum made a picture for George Willard. In the picture, men lived again in a kind of pastoral golden age. Across a green open country came clean-limbed young men, some afoot, some mounted upon horses. In crowds the young men came together to gather about the feet of an old man who sat beneath a tree in a tidy garden and talked to him. And we're told that this is an image, in your footnote, invokes the ideals of Greek Golden Age generally, and more particularly the image of the Athenian philosopher Socrates teaching young Greek aristocrats, right? And Wing Biddlebaum became wholly inspired, for once he forgot the hands. Okay, slowly they stole forth and lay upon George Willard's shoulders. Something new and bold came into the voice that talked. You must try to forget all that you have learned, said the man. You must begin to dream. Now this goes towards the issues as well, this repression of this small town life, and we see this in the short story Mother as well, where both the father and the mother are trying to live through George. He himself is a repressed entity by the oppressive forces, the repressive forces of the small town, and his parents are trying to live through him. It all is causing George, as the main character, as the protagonist in these stories, to really be conflicted and to suffer. And so that's what's going on here as well. And so when Wing is trying to say, escape, he puts his hand on his shoulder. For a moment there, he's unable to control his instinct, and it breaks through, whatever that means. Passing in his speech, Wing Biddlebaum looked long and earnestly. Again, he raised his hands to caress the boy, and then a look of horror swept over his face. With a convulsive movement of his body, Wing Biddlebaum sprang to his feet and thrust his hands deep into his trouser pockets. Tears came to his eyes. I must be getting on home. I can talk no more with you, he said. Now, early in the narrative, we have this line that says, the story of Wing Biddlebaum is a story of hands. So Anderson is setting this up in this kind of study, Daisy Miller study, Edna Pontier, sort of study of human behavior. Their restless activity, like unto the beating of the wings of an imprisoned bird, had given him his name. Some obscure poet of the town thought of it. The hands alarmed their owner. So this scene where he's caressing George, and remember, he's fraught with the excitement of learning and teaching and imparting a lesson to him in this Greek sort of way. But we also know about the Greeks, right? And so we know that there is also that element of it, that it could be an amorous, a sexual attraction that he has towards these young men as well. And we see later it's a very short story, but in the next page we go back in the history to Wing when he was Adolph Myers, and he was this beloved teacher in this town. He was one of those rare, little understood men. This is on page 254 or 255, who rule by a power so gentle that it passes as a lovable weakness. In their feelings for the boys under their charge, such men are not unlike the finer sort of women and their love of men. Interesting sort of choices, right? So a kind of love of knowledge, an affection for these children, but also a kind of affection that is similar to what the love of women and the love of their men. And yet that is but crudely stated. It needs the poet there. With the boys of this school, Adolph Myers had walked in the evening or had sat talking at dusk upon the schoolhouse steps, lost in a kind of dream. There's that language he was using with George about the dream. And this language about the dream comes up later in the story Mother as well. So there's something about dreams, and remember, Freud was all about the dream analysis as well. So something about dreams is going on here. So there's many layered psychosocial drama going on here. Here and there went his hands caressing the shoulders of the boys, playing about the tousled heads, right? Could be innocent, maybe too much. As he talked, his voice became soft and musical, like it did with George in the scene earlier. There was a caress in that also. In a way, the voice, the hands, the stroking of the shoulders, and the touching of the hair was a part of the schoolmaster's effort to carry out a dream into the young minds. By the caress that was in his fingers, he expressed himself. So the hands are expressing themselves. But are they expressing something appropriate, something deep-seated, a passion, or are they expressing something inappropriate? Under the caress of his hands, doubt and disbelief went into the mind of the boy and began also to dream. And then the tragedy. A half-witted boy. So see, here's more doubt. Maybe the boy misunderstood. Maybe Adolph is innocent. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Enamored of the young master. Maybe the young boy himself had this sort of romantic attachment, same-sex attraction, you know. All of these things would have been very much discussed in this Freudian world where you're like interested in what is these things that we might see as abnormal. And so this same-sex attraction, this attraction towards young men. In his bed at night, he imagined unspeakable things, and in the morning went forth to tell his dreams as facts. Well, I don't know. Anderson seems to be suggesting that it never happened that way, but the town is convinced. Strange, hideous accusations fell from the loose lips, shadowy doubts, and then, I think appropriately, he's beaten to near death. The fists, they beat him with their fists. There's a lot of language on, I will teach you to put your hands on my boy, you beast, roared the saloon keeper, who's beating Wing with Adolf with his hands. All ties to the symbolism. So that's what Freud would say, well, maybe the repression, maybe the way the hands are so fidgety has to do with the repressed desire. Maybe it has to do with the trauma he experienced at the hands, literally, of the townspeople, and at the hands of these people that beat him and threatened to kill him, threatened to basically lynch him as well. So quintessential Anderson, after this scene, and go through that passage where they attack Adolf, and you'll see the use of hands, the expression of hands is used over and over again. For 20 years, Adolf Myers had lived alone in Weinsberg. He was but 40, but looked 65. The name Biddlebaum he got from a box of goods seen at the freight station as he hurried through an eastern Ohio town. He had an aunt in Weinsberg, a black-toothed old woman who raised chickens, and with her he lived until she died. He had been ill for a year after the experience in Pennsylvania, and after his recovery worked as a day laborer in the fields. It just is not a very pleasant life. And keep your hands to yourself. Keep your hands to yourself. That's the mantra. And then we have this final scene. It's all pretty good. I mean, it's Anderson's pretty good. It's got this textured layer. It's got this psychoanalytic sort of drama going on. But he ends it with such an interesting sort of motif, and it goes back to those notions that we talked about with the modern, and what we see in Mother and what we see with Adventure, where maybe something could make this life not so miserable for Adolf Nie Wing if he could find a higher reason or purpose in life. It's almost like the places where you could seek that solace, faith, art, other ways he could sublimate his passions, these inappropriate feelings with his hands. They don't work for him. They're bankrupt. And so after this day of the harvest of berries, the science of the number, he went again to walk upon the veranda. It's on page 256. And we have this stunning image at the end. In the darkness, he could not see the hands, and they became quiet, right? So if he can't see the hands, he's kind of okay. Although he still hungered for the presence of the boy, who was the medium through which he expressed his love of man. See that uncertainty there? Is he in love with George Willard as an ideal sort of Greek sense of learning and dreaming, or is he in love with him in sort of a sexual way? The hunger became again a part of his loneliness and his waiting. Lighting a lamp, Wing Biddlebaum washed the few dishes soiled by a simple meal, setting up a folding cot by the screen door that led to the porch, prepared to undress for the night, kind of in a ritual way, right? A few stray white breadcrumbs lay on the cleanly washed floor by the table. Putting the lamp upon a low stool, he began to pick up the crumbs, carrying them to his mouth one by one with unbelievable rapidity. In the dense blotch of light beneath the table, the kneeling figure looked like a priest engaged in some service of his church. And you have that other potent image of the crumb of bread, the communion, right? But it is this disease, it is this repression coming out. It's the yellow wallpaper, it's this rupture. He's got OCD or something. He's crazy eating these crumbs off the floor with these nervous hands, right? What an image, expressed as kind of a priest-like symbol. The nervous, expressive fingers flashing in and out of the light with the light, very dramatic, might well have been mistaken for the fingers of a devotee going swiftly and through decade after decade with the rosary. It reminds me of Louisa and New England Nun. It reminds me of all these allusions we see in these stories where people are sort of supposed to be doing something ritualistic, something religious, but in this case it's pathetic, it's sad. It brings him no solace, it brings him no meaning. And you wonder if Anderson is alluding somehow to what Freud had written in that piece we read for last class period about religion being a mass delusion. And here is just a sad, pathetic man who is tormented by his repressed desires. Or is there an illusion that if he could find some way to deal with his repression, he could be happy again? I don't know, something like that. But if you can figure that out in the story, you see that there's the Freudian connections.